April 29th, 1945. Dachau concentration camp, 12 miles northwest of Munich. American soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division and elements of the 42nd Rainbow Division arrive expecting to secure an enemy facility. They're combat veterans. They've seen action across France and Germany. They've encountered death in various forms, artillery strikes, urban warfare, the aftermath of battlefield engagements. What they find waiting inside Dachau's gates shatters something fundamental. Railroad cars line a spur track near the camp entrance, dozens of them. As the first soldiers approach, they see bodies packed inside. Thousands of corpses, stacked like cargo, emaciated beyond recognition, left to rot in open freight cars under the spring sun. That scene, that single discovery in those first moments, breaks military discipline and triggers immediate executions of SS guards. Not after courts-martial, not after interrogation, on the spot, within minutes of the discovery. Here's what you need to understand before we go any further. These weren't rogue soldiers. These were trained troops operating under military law. The United States Army had rules of engagement, procedures for handling prisoners, a legal framework that applied even to enemy combatants. The men who liberated Dachau knew those rules. And in the hour following that discovery, dozens of SS guards died at American hands in what would later become known as the Dachau Liberation Reprisals. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what happened in that compound, what the Americans found when they entered, why that discovery triggered immediate violence, what happened in the minutes and hours that followed, and how the U.S. Army grappled with the legal and moral aftermath of soldiers executing prisoners. Because this isn't a story about heroes or villains. This is about the point where human beings, even disciplined soldiers, reach a moral breaking point, where training fails, where the rules designed to separate justice from revenge collapse under the weight of what your eyes are showing you. And here's what makes this moment historically critical. The violence wasn't hidden, it was witnessed, it was reported. It triggered an official U.S. Army investigation that produced a document examining whether American soldiers committed war crimes in the act of liberating a concentration camp. That investigation's findings remain controversial 8 decades later. So the question isn't whether executions happened. The evidence makes that undeniable. The question is, what pushes trained soldiers past the boundary between combat and murder? And whether that boundary even exists when you're standing next to railroad cars filled with thousands of corpses. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why liberation became something more complicated than freedom, why the photographs from that day show both unspeakable horror and immediate retribution, and why the U.S. Army never fully resolved what to do about soldiers who broke the rules in response to the unimaginable. But first, we need to understand what those soldiers expected to find versus what actually waited for them. Before we dive in, if you're interested in deep dive historical analysis of World War II combat, liberation, and the moral decisions that soldiers faced in the final days of the war, using primary documentation and eyewitness accounts, please hit that subscribe button. And as we go through this story, drop a comment telling me where you think the line is. When does revenge become justice? When does justice become revenge? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know what you think. All right, let's get into it. Now, we go back to the morning of April 29th. Before the gates open, before the discovery, the 45th Infantry Division has been pushing through Bavaria for weeks. They've encountered sporadic German resistance, but by late April, organized Wehrmacht units are collapsing. Most towns surrender without a fight. The war is ending. Everyone knows it. On April 28th, intelligence reports indicate there's a large detention facility near the town of Dachau. Not much detail. The term concentration camp is used, but American commanders don't fully grasp what that means yet. They know the Germans have been imprisoning political enemies and forced laborers. They don't yet comprehend the scale or the systematic nature of what's been happening. Some units have encountered smaller camps in recent weeks. They've seen prisoners in poor condition, but nothing prepares the soldiers approaching Dachau for what's waiting. The column moves through the town in the early afternoon. Local civilians watch from windows, faces blank. Some offer no resistance. A few try to wave white flags. The Americans push past them toward the facility. They can smell it before they see it. That's the detail that appears in multiple accounts. The smell? A sickly sweet stench of decay that intensifies as they get closer. Some soldiers think it's a chemical plant. Others assume it's sewage. A few veterans who've seen mass casualties recognize it immediately for what it is. The smell of death on a scale none of them have encountered. The outer perimeter comes into view. High walls, guard towers, barbed wire. It looks like a military installation. Soldiers expect perhaps a prisoner of war camp, maybe political detainees. They're ready for hostile guards. They're ready for a fight, if necessary. The gates are open, or forced open. Accounts vary. Some reports say German guards fled. Others say they stayed, uncertain what to do as American forces arrived. A few tried to surrender immediately. And then the Americans see the train. 39 freight cars sitting motionless on a spur track. The doors are open on most of them, or partially open. Bodies spill out onto the ground. Inside the cars, more bodies, packed so tightly that it's difficult to distinguish individual forms. Skeletal remains, some partially decomposed. The cars had been sealed during transport, then abandoned as the SS fled. Estimates later put the death toll in those cars alone at over 2,000 people. The soldiers stop, some stare, some turn away and vomit. A few start trying to count, then give up because the numbers don't make sense. Your brain can process 10 bodies, 20, maybe 50 if it's a mass casualty event. 2,000 corpses packed into train cars isn't something human cognition handles easily. One soldier later described it in a deposition. He said it looked like someone had tried to stuff a freight train with firewood, except the firewood was people. Another said the bodies had melted together in the heat. A third couldn't find words at all and just said he stopped thinking clearly after that. This is the scene. The one scene that the title promised. This is what breaks discipline. But here's what most accounts miss. The violence doesn't start immediately at the train. There's a few minutes of shock, of trying to process, of soldiers radiating outward, investigating, moving deeper into the compound. Because the train isn't the only horror. The Americans push deeper into the compound, past the train, past the administrative buildings, and they find the prisoner barracks. Men in striped uniforms emerge, thousands of them, living skeletons, hollow eyes, skin stretched over bone. Some can barely walk, others crawl. A few collapse trying to reach the Americans. These are the survivors. More than 30,000 prisoners still alive in the camp, and their condition tells the soldiers everything about what's been happening here. This wasn't a prison. This was an extermination facility that hadn't finished its work before the war ended. One soldier later testified that he saw a man whose arm was so thin he could wrap his fingers around the bicep with room to spare. Another described prisoners who looked like they weighed maybe 70 or 80 pounds. A third said he watched a prisoner try to smile in gratitude, and the man's face looked like a skull attempting a human expression. And walking among these prisoners, or trying to surrender to the Americans, are SS guards in uniform. Here's where the situation becomes combustible. The SS guards aren't fighting. Most have thrown down their weapons. They're attempting to surrender according to the rules of war. Under the Geneva Conventions, they're entitled to be taken prisoner, held until the war ends, and then repatriated or tried for specific crimes. The American soldiers know this. They've taken German prisoners before. They know the procedure. But those previous prisoners were Wehrmacht soldiers captured in battle. Men who fought, lost, and surrendered. These SS guards were running a death camp, and the evidence of what they've been doing is everywhere. In the train cars, in the emaciated prisoners, in the crematorium ovens that soldiers are now discovering, in the piles of bodies stacked near the buildings, because even the crematoriums couldn't keep pace with the death rate. Some guards try to claim they were just following orders. Some try to say they didn't know what was happening. Some stay silent. And in the chaos of the first hour, as soldiers spread through the compound documenting atrocities, something breaks. A shot. Then more shots. Not organized, not directed by officers. Spontaneous violence erupting from multiple points in the compound as individual soldiers or small groups encounter guards and execute them. One report describes a guard attempting to surrender to a squad near the train. A soldier raises his rifle and shoots the guard in the head. The other guards nearby panic and run. More shots. 4 or 5 guards dead in seconds. Another incident near the barracks. A group of prisoners points out a particularly brutal capo, a prisoner who'd been given authority over others. Soldiers drag him to a wall and shoot him without discussion. Then comes the incident that would dominate the Army investigation. Near the camp's coal yard, Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, a Cherokee officer from Oklahoma serving with I Company, 157th Infantry Regiment, orders a machine gun set up facing a group of SS guards who've been assembled against a wall. The guards have their hands raised. Some are pleading. Bushyhead gives the order. The gunner opens fire. Somewhere between 12 and 17 guards drop. Some die instantly. Others are wounded, writhing on the ground. A few prisoners who've been watching rush forward and finish the wounded with whatever they can find. This is the execution that becomes the centerpiece of later investigations. Not spontaneous. Not a single soldier losing control. An officer giving an order. A deliberate act. But before the killing can spread further, Colonel Felix Sparks arrives. Sparks commands the 3rd Battalion, 157th Infantry Regiment. He's a combat veteran, 27 years old, already hardened by months of fighting. But when he sees what's happening, when he realizes American soldiers are executing prisoners, he moves to stop it immediately. Sparks physically intervenes. He orders soldiers to cease fire. When some hesitate, he threatens to shoot anyone who continues executing guards. He begins reasserting command authority, separating guards from prisoners, establishing a perimeter, trying to restore military discipline, but he's too late to prevent what's already happened. And he's fighting against the momentum of rage that's building throughout the compound. because while Sparks is restoring order in one section, violence is erupting elsewhere. And here's what makes the reprisals even more complicated. Some of the most brutal killings aren't carried out by American soldiers at all. Liberated prisoners, men who've endured years of torture and watched friends die, see their tormentors suddenly vulnerable. They find tools, shovels, iron bars, lengths of wood, and they attack guards with a fury that years of imprisonment have built. Near the administration building, prisoners corner 3 SS guards. American soldiers are nearby, close enough to intervene, but they don't. They watch as prisoners beat the guards to death with shovels, skull fractures, broken bones, deaths that take minutes of sustained violence. Another incident near the barracks. Prisoners identify a guard who'd been particularly cruel, responsible for beatings and selections for execution. They drag him into an open area. Someone finds an iron bar. The beating is prolonged and savage. American troops stand less than 20 yards away. They make no move to stop it. A third killing near the crematorium. Prisoners force a guard to the ground. Multiple prisoners attack with whatever implements they can grab. The guard's screams last for several minutes before they stop. Soldiers witness the entire event. Some turn away, none intervene. This permissive stance, American troops allowing prisoners to exact revenge while standing by as armed observers, complicates the moral calculus even further, because it's one thing for soldiers under extreme stress to shoot surrendering enemies. It's another to stand guard while prisoners commit acts of brutal retribution. The justification, such as it was, ran something like this. These guards had tortured and murdered for years. The prisoners had more right to justice than anyone. American soldiers weren't going to protect SS personnel from the consequences of their own actions. But that justification crumbles under legal scrutiny. Once guards surrender, they're under the protection of the capturing force. Allowing prisoners to kill them is, legally, tantamount to executing them yourself. The Army's later investigation would struggle with this distinction. How do you prosecute soldiers who didn't pull triggers but stood by while prisoners used shovels and iron bars? How do you distinguish between passive observation and active facilitation? The violence continues sporadically through the afternoon. Some prisoners seek out specific guards, men they recognize as particularly brutal. Some American soldiers, unable to process what they're seeing, default to looking the other way. A few officers, like Sparks, try desperately to impose control. But the compound is large, the chaos widespread, and command authority fragmented. By evening, order is mostly restored. Guards who survived the initial violence are secured. Prisoners are given medical attention and food. The compound begins transitioning from a scene of chaotic violence to an organized relief operation. But the damage is done. Bodies of SS guards lie scattered throughout the facility, some shot, some beaten to death. The exact count remains disputed, but estimates range from 30 to 50 guards killed in reprisals during the first day of liberation. Within hours of the liberation, reports start reaching higher command. Officers on the ground send dispatches describing the camp conditions, the prisoner count, the state of the survivors. And buried in those reports are mentions of irregularities, guards killed after surrender, prisoners taking revenge while American troops stood by, incidents that don't match standard operating procedure. Some commanders want to ignore it. The war is almost over. Germany is collapsing. Why create a scandal over dead SS guards when the evidence of their crimes is overwhelming? But the reports keep coming. Too many witnesses, too many incidents, and some officers, concerned about maintaining military discipline and the integrity of American forces, push for a formal investigation. By early May, less than a week after liberation, the U.S. Army Inspector General's office begins collecting statements. They interview soldiers who were present. They talk to officers who witnessed the executions or heard reports. They document the timeline of events on April 29th. Lieutenant Bushyhead's name appears repeatedly in witness statements. Colonel Sparks is interviewed about his efforts to stop the violence and his observations of what occurred before he could intervene. The investigation reveals a pattern. The executions weren't ordered by command. They were spontaneous acts by individual soldiers or small groups, punctuated by specific incidents like Bushyhead's coal yard shooting. In some cases, officers like Sparks tried to stop the violence. In others, officers either participated or looked the other way. One particularly detailed account describes the machine gun incident Bushyhead ordered. Multiple witnesses confirm it happened. The gunner is identified. The approximate number of guards killed is documented. But investigators also note the context. Bushyhead had just walked through the death train. He'd seen the prisoners. The execution happened within an hour of that discovery. Another account describes Sparks confronting soldiers who were about to execute additional guards, his threat to shoot anyone who continued, his visible anger at the breakdown in discipline. Sparks becomes, in the investigation, a figure of attempted restraint, someone trying to maintain the boundary between liberation and lawless revenge. But the accounts also detail what Sparks and other officers couldn't or didn't stop. prisoners wielding shovels and iron bars, beating guards to death while American soldiers watched. Some witnesses describe feeling paralyzed, unsure whether to protect guards from prisoners who'd been victimized for years. Others admit they simply decided the guards deserved whatever happened to them. These incidents raise impossible questions. How do you prosecute soldiers for killing men who operated Dachau? How do you maintain military discipline when the very idea of giving due process to concentration camp guards seems morally obscene? And what do you do about soldiers who didn't kill anyone themselves, but stood by while prisoners did? The investigation drags on for weeks. Statements are taken. Evidence is collected. The Inspector General's office compiles a report documenting the reprisals and attempting to determine whether war crimes were committed by American forces. Here's what makes this investigation historically significant. It's one of the few instances where the U.S. military seriously examined whether its own troops violated the laws of war during liberation operations. The findings were nuanced, uncomfortable, and never fully resolved. Some soldiers were identified as having participated in executions. Lieutenant Bushyhead faced potential court-martial. But prosecutions were rare and charges were ultimately reduced or dropped. A few faced administrative discipline, reassignments, or reprimands, but no major courts-martial, no public trials. The Army's position seemed to be that while the executions were technically violations of military law, the circumstances were so extraordinary that harsh punishment would be unjust. Colonel Sparks, meanwhile, continued his military career. His efforts to stop the executions were noted favorably. He was never charged with any failure to maintain control, though the investigation acknowledged that violence occurred under his nominal command. And there's another factor: public opinion. When news of Dachau's liberation reached the American public, the reaction was horror at the camp conditions, not outrage at dead SS guards. Photographs of the train cars, of the emaciated prisoners, of the crematorium ovens circulated widely. In that context, executing camp guards seemed to many Americans like a reasonable response. The Army faced political pressure not to prosecute. Why make martyrs of soldiers who'd liberated a death camp? Why create a scandal that might distract from the larger story of Nazi atrocities? So the investigation concluded with a muted outcome. Incidents were documented, violations were acknowledged, but consequences were minimal. That decision has been debated ever since. Some historians argue the Army should have held soldiers accountable regardless of circumstances, that maintaining the moral authority to prosecute Nazi war crimes required holding American troops to the same standards. Others argue that prosecuting soldiers for killing SS guards at Dachau would have been a grotesque miscarriage of justice, that context matters, and that what happened in those first chaotic hours was a human response to an inhuman discovery. Both positions have merit, and that's precisely what makes this moment so morally complicated. Because here's the deeper truth. The executions at Dachau weren't about military justice. They weren't even primarily about revenge. They were about a fundamental rupture in the soldiers' understanding of the world. These men had been taught certain principles. Human life has value. Laws exist to protect the innocent. Even enemies deserve basic treatment according to international conventions. And then they walked through Dachau and found systematic negation of all those principles. Found evidence that an entire apparatus, bureaucratic and methodical, had been designed to reduce humans to corpses as efficiently as possible. The guards represented that system. They'd participated in it, they'd enabled it, and now they wanted protection under the very laws and conventions they'd spent years violating. The soldiers who executed those guards, like Lieutenant Bushyhead, weren't acting from bloodlust. They were acting from moral rage, from the recognition that some crimes are so absolute that the usual procedures seem inadequate. The soldiers who stood by while prisoners used shovels and iron bars weren't celebrating violence. They were caught between competing obligations: protect all prisoners under your control, or let victims have a moment of justice against their tormentors. But here's the problem. Once you abandon procedure, once you let rage dictate justice, where does it stop? How do you distinguish between a justified execution of a death camp guard and an unjustified murder of a surrendering soldier? The answer is, you can't. Not cleanly. That's why laws exist, to prevent soldiers from becoming judges and executioners, to maintain a boundary between combat and murder. The soldiers at Dachau crossed that boundary. Some, like Bushyhead, willingly ordered killings. Some reluctantly watched as prisoners beat guards to death. Others, like Sparks, fought to maintain the line even as it collapsed around them. But they all faced the same impossible situation. And the U.S. Army, in choosing not to prosecute aggressively, effectively said the boundary was negotiable under extreme circumstances. That decision has consequences that ripple through military justice to this day. Let me be more specific about why Dachau triggered this response when other German atrocities hadn't. American troops had encountered violence before. They'd seen civilian casualties. They'd fought through destroyed towns. They'd witnessed the aftermath of SS massacres of prisoners and civilians. But Dachau was different in scale and in character. It wasn't collateral damage from combat. It wasn't a heat of battle massacre, it was industrial, methodical. The camp had been operating for 12 years, since 1933. It was one of the first concentration camps, a prototype for the system that would eventually kill millions. The soldiers arriving on April 29th were encountering the end result of 12 years of systematic dehumanization. And that systematization is what broke something in them. Combat violence has a certain logic. You fight the enemy, people die. It's brutal, but it follows patterns soldiers can comprehend. What happened at Dachau followed a different pattern. Administrative, bureaucratic, guards showing up for shifts, prisoners processed through intake, bodies disposed of according to procedure, death is routine. That routinization of murder is what soldiers couldn't process. A guard who shoots at you in battle is comprehensible. A guard who clocks in for his shift at a death camp, processes prisoners to their execution, then goes home to dinner with his family, that's something else entirely. And when those guards tried to surrender, tried to claim protection under military law, the disconnect was too large. The soldiers saw men asking for rights they'd spent years systematically denying to others. Some soldiers articulated this in their statements to investigators. One soldier said he couldn't reconcile treating SS guards as prisoners of war, when those same guards had reduced thousands of humans to the condition he saw in the barracks. Another said the guards looked too normal, too ordinary, and that made it worse somehow, the recognition that systematic atrocity doesn't require monsters, just bureaucrats willing to follow orders. This gets at something crucial. The executions weren't primarily about punishment. They were about reasserting moral boundaries that the camp had obliterated. The soldiers who pulled those triggers, who gave orders like Bushyhead did, or who stood watching as prisoners wielded shovels and iron bars, were saying, in effect, there are limits. There are acts so beyond the pale that the usual rules don't apply. These guards crossed those limits, and we're drawing the line here, right now, with or without authorization. But here's the paradox. In drawing that line, the soldiers crossed their own boundaries. They became executioners. They violated the military code they'd sworn to uphold. They committed acts that, in a different context, would be war crimes. That's the moral injury, not just witnessing horror, but being changed by it, becoming something different than what you were trained to be. Some soldiers struggled with that for the rest of their lives. Interviews with Dachau liberators, conducted decades later, reveal persistent guilt, not about what they found, but about what they did in response. Men who said they understood why they'd pulled the trigger but couldn't reconcile it with who they thought they were. Others, including some who watched prisoners exact brutal revenge while they stood guard, expressed no regret, said they'd do it again. Said the SS guards got what they deserved and the only mistake was not executing more of them. Both responses are authentic. Both reflect the impossible situation those soldiers faced. And that impossibility is what makes Dachau's liberation different from other camp liberations. Other sites, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, had similar atrocities. But the Dachau reprisals stand out because they were immediate, widespread, and relatively well documented. The documentation exists because some officers, even in the chaos of liberation, tried to maintain records. They knew what was happening was significant. They knew it would be investigated. So they took statements, filed reports, created a paper trail. That paper trail now sits in military archives. Incident reports describing executions, witness statements from soldiers who saw guards killed, testimony about Lieutenant Bushyhead's coal yard shooting, accounts of Colonel Sparks threatening to shoot his own men to stop the violence, descriptions of prisoners using shovels and iron bars while Americans watched, investigative documents attempting to determine accountability, all of it preserved, creating a historical record of American soldiers violating the laws of war in the act of ending Nazi atrocities. It's uncomfortable history. It doesn't fit clean narratives about the good war or the greatest generation. It shows American troops committing acts that, if committed by the enemy, would be called war crimes. But it's also deeply human history. It shows what happens when ordinary people, even disciplined soldiers, encounter absolute evil. It shows that moral clarity, the certainty that you're fighting for the right side, doesn't always translate into morally clear actions. The soldiers at Dachau knew they were liberators. They knew the SS were criminals. But knowing that didn't prevent them from crossing lines they'd been trained to respect. And the Army's response, minimal prosecution, administrative resolution, set a precedent. It said that context matters, that extraordinary circumstances can mitigate violations, that sometimes maintaining moral authority means acknowledging complexity rather than insisting on absolute adherence to rules. Whether that was the right decision remains debated. Legal scholars, military historians, and ethicists continue arguing about whether the executions were justified, whether the Army should have prosecuted more aggressively, whether holding soldiers accountable would have strengthened or undermined American moral authority in prosecuting Nazi war criminals. There's no consensus. Just competing values, justice versus revenge, discipline versus humanity, rules versus circumstances, colliding in a moment too extreme for easy answers. What you need to understand is that the Dachau reprisals didn't happen in isolation. They were part of a larger pattern emerging in the final weeks of the war as Allied forces encountered the concentration camp system. But Dachau was unique for several reasons. First, the timing. It was liberated in the final days of April when the war was clearly ending. Soldiers weren't operating under the pressure of ongoing combat. They had time to process what they were seeing, and they still executed guards. Second, the composition of the liberating forces. The 45th Infantry Division and elements of the 42nd were experienced units. They'd fought through Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany. These weren't green troops prone to panic or rash decisions. They were veterans who'd proven their discipline under fire. Officers like Felix Sparks had commanded men through brutal campaigns. Lieutenant Bushyhead was a combat-tested leader. That's what makes the breakdown so significant. If experienced, disciplined troops reach a breaking point, what does that say about the nature of what they encountered? Third, and perhaps most importantly, the physical evidence. The death train provided immediate, visceral, undeniable proof of systematic murder. There was no ambiguity, no room for guards to claim they didn't know, or they were just following minor orders, or the camp was primarily a labor facility. 2,000 corpses in railroad cars don't allow for that kind of rationalization. Some guards tried anyway. Survivors and witnesses reported SS personnel claiming they'd just arrived, or they were clerks who never harmed anyone, or they'd actually tried to help prisoners when possible. The soldiers didn't believe them, couldn't believe them, not standing next to those train cars. And here's what the historical record shows. The executions happened in waves. The first was immediate, in the first hour of liberation, driven by spontaneous rage. Soldiers encountering guards and shooting them without thinking. Then came more organized incidents like the coal yard shooting Bushyhead ordered. The second wave came later as order was being partially restored, but before full command control was reestablished. Small groups of soldiers, sometimes with tacit approval from junior officers, systematically hunting for SS guards who'd tried to hide or blend in with Wehrmacht prisoners. And running parallel to all of this, prisoners exacting revenge with whatever tools they could find, shovels, iron bars, lengths of wood, while American soldiers watched without intervening. That second wave is more troubling from a legal perspective because it wasn't spontaneous, it was deliberate. Soldiers making conscious decisions to execute prisoners after the initial shock had worn off, or making conscious decisions to stand guard while prisoners beat guards to death. Why? Because the scale kept revealing itself. As soldiers explored the camp more thoroughly, they found additional horrors. The crematoriums with partially burned bodies still inside, the gas chamber facilities, the medical experimentation areas, the punishment cells where prisoners had been tortured. Each new discovery reinforced the conviction that the guards deserved immediate execution, not trials, not imprisonment, just death. And if prisoners wanted to deliver that death with shovels instead of bullets, so be it, and the prisoners encouraged it. Liberated inmates pointed out particularly brutal guards. They described specific atrocities, beatings, murders, torture. They asked American soldiers why they were showing mercy to men who'd shown none. Some soldiers listened, some acted on what they heard. The executions continued sporadically through the first day and into the evening of April 29th, until senior officers like Sparks and others arrived and imposed strict control. But by then, the damage was done. Dozens of guards dead, some shot, some beaten to death, multiple witnesses, a situation that couldn't be covered up or ignored. The Army's investigation tried to determine exact numbers, how many guards were killed in reprisals, how many soldiers participated, which officers knew and failed to stop it. How many deaths were caused by soldiers versus by prisoners using improvised weapons? The answers were complicated. Witness statements conflicted. Some soldiers claimed they saw 10 guards executed. Others said 30 or more. Some reported officers like Sparks ordering troops to cease fire. Others said officers participated in the executions, or more commonly, simply turned away while prisoners used shovels and iron bars. The chaos of liberation made precise accounting impossible, and some participants had no interest in providing accurate information. They knew what they'd done violated military law. Why confess to specifics that might lead to court-martial? So the investigation produced a report documenting that violations occurred, identifying general patterns, but stopping short of comprehensive accountability. It named individuals like Bushyhead. It praised restraint shown by officers like Sparks. It documented the phenomenon of prisoners killing guards while Americans watched. But it didn't push for the kind of aggressive prosecution that war crimes typically demanded. Why not? Multiple factors. Combat fatigue and recognition that the soldiers had been under extreme stress for months. The extraordinary nature of what they encountered. Political pressure from a public that saw dead SS guards as justice, not crime. And perhaps most significantly, the hypocrisy of prosecuting American soldiers for executing concentration camp guards while simultaneously preparing to prosecute Nazi officials for the same camps. How do you argue that SS guards deserve due process, while also arguing that what they did was so monstrous it violates fundamental human rights? The positions don't easily reconcile. The Army chose pragmatism over principle. Document the incidents, acknowledge wrongdoing, impose minimal consequences, move on. That choice created precedent. It established that American military justice has flexibility, that context can override procedure, that some circumstances are too extreme for standard rules to apply cleanly. Whether that precedent is positive or negative depends on your perspective. It's positive if you believe rigid adherence to rules in extraordinary situations is itself a form of injustice. It's negative if you believe that abandoning rules, even temporarily, undermines the entire legal framework that distinguishes legitimate military action from atrocity. Both views have validity, and the tension between them defines how we understand Dachau's liberation. But here's what often gets lost in legal and ethical debates: the psychological cost. The soldiers who executed guards at Dachau carried that action for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Bushyhead, the machine gunner who followed his order, the men who stood by while prisoners used shovels and iron bars, it changed them. Some became advocates for military discipline, arguing that they'd crossed a line and others shouldn't. Some became hardened, convinced that certain enemies don't deserve the protections of law. Some simply stayed silent, unable or unwilling to discuss what they'd done. Some of them only opened up decades later in oral histories and interviews. They described the liberation in vivid detail: the smell, the train, the barracks, the faces of the prisoners. When they reached the point in the story where guards were shot or beaten to death, their voices often changed, slower, more hesitant. Sometimes they defended their actions. Sometimes they just said, "That's what happened," and moved on. This is important, because what happened at Dachau wasn't just a legal problem for the U.S. Army. It was a moral fracture for the men involved. The executions gave them a sense of immediate justice in the moment, but afterward, some of them were left wondering whether they'd stepped into the same moral gray zone they'd come to condemn. This wasn't about courage. It was about boundaries. And that brings us back to the central question. Why did this one scene, the death train at Dachau, do what months of combat and countless other atrocities hadn't? Why did this moment trigger on-the-spot executions in a way that other horrors did not? Because the train collapsed distance. Most wartime killing happens at a remove. Artillery, bombing, rifle fire at a target you can barely see. Even massacres, as horrific as they are, can be understood as explosions of violence at a point in time. The train was different. It was the end point of a process. You could walk along the cars and see what systematic starvation and neglect do to a human body. You could see how long it must have taken for these people to die, day by day, hour by hour, turned into cargo. The soldiers weren't looking at an explosion of violence. They were looking at the residue of policy. This wasn't about combat. It was about a system. Once you understand that, the soldiers' reaction becomes more legible. They weren't just punishing individuals. They were striking at the nearest visible representatives of that system: the guards, the uniforms, the men who'd enforced the policies that filled those cars. But if you step back farther, another layer emerges. The reprisal killings at Dachau pose a deeper question. What happens to the rule of law when law itself has been used to justify atrocity? The guards could claim they'd acted under German law. The camp itself functioned under decrees, regulations, official orders. Everything done there was, in a narrow sense, legal within the Nazi system. The Americans brought a different law with them: international conventions, military codes, the idea of universal rights. At the moment of liberation, those two systems collided. On paper, the American code required that even SS personnel be taken prisoner and processed. In practice, the sight of the train made that requirement feel like an insult to the dead. So soldiers defaulted to something older than any statute: raw moral outrage. They didn't convene tribunals. They didn't weigh evidence. They looked at the train, looked at the guards, and decided. Some, like Bushyhead, gave orders. Others executed those orders. Still others stood by while prisoners wielded shovels and iron bars, making their own decisions about when justice and revenge become indistinguishable. You could argue that's the purest form of justice. You could argue it's the most dangerous. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about reasserting a moral universe. That's one way to frame it. But a different framing is just as true. This wasn't about justice. It was about men pushed beyond what discipline can contain. Both statements describe the same gunshots. Both describe the same shovels swinging while soldiers watched. After the war, as the U.S. prepared major trials against Nazi leaders, the Dachau reprisals sat in the background like a quiet contradiction. American prosecutors would stand in courtrooms and argue that no circumstances, no stress, no orders from above could justify summary executions or atrocities against prisoners. They would insist that law must stand above rage. And somewhere in military files sat a report describing American soldiers shooting surrendering guards at Dachau. describing Lieutenant Bushyhead ordering machine gun fire on prisoners with raised hands, describing Colonel Sparks desperately trying to stop the violence, describing American troops standing guard while liberated prisoners beat SS guards to death with shovels and iron bars. The solution, unofficially, was to treat the Dachau reprisals as an aberration, an understandable outburst in extraordinary circumstances. The very extremity of the camp's crimes became the excuse for not pursuing the case more aggressively. In that sense, the guards died twice, once at the wall or under shovels and iron bars, and again in the decision not to speak too loudly about how they'd been killed. This is where the story widens beyond Dachau, because what happened there forces a question that doesn't have an easy answer. If you had walked through those train cars, if you had seen those prisoners, what would you have done? It's easy to say you would have maintained discipline, followed the code, insisted on trials. It's just as easy to say you would have done exactly what those soldiers did, whether pulling the trigger yourself or standing aside while prisoners took revenge with whatever tools they could find. The uncomfortable truth is that none of us can know with certainty who we would have been on that track, in that yard, with that smell in our lungs. And that's why this moment still matters. It shows how thin the line can be between lawful force and unlawful killing, even for people who see themselves as the good side. It shows that the presence of absolute evil doesn't magically turn all responses into good. It shows that being right about who the villains are doesn't guarantee you won't cross lines yourself. The Dachau scene, the death train, is often remembered as evidence of Nazi barbarity. It should be, but it's also the trigger for a different memory. American soldiers, faces set, raising rifles at men in SS uniforms who were no longer shooting back. Lieutenant Bushyhead giving an order that would haunt investigators for months. Colonel Sparks threatening to shoot his own men to maintain a boundary that was already shattered. And American troops standing watch while prisoners wielded shovels and iron bars against guards who'd once held absolute power over them. The first image tells you what human beings are capable of doing to the powerless over years. The second tells you what the powerful are capable of doing in a single afternoon when confronted with that fact. The third tells you how complicated justice becomes when victims finally have the chance to strike back. All three belong to the story. So here's the question this video leaves you with, and there's no safe, neat way around it. If you were standing on that rail line, with those cars open in front of you, and those guards a few yards away asking for mercy, would you have insisted on the rule of law, or would you have pulled the trigger? Would you have given the order like Bushyhead did? Would you have tried to stop it like Sparks? Or would you have stood aside and let prisoners with shovels and iron bars deliver their own justice? And if you pulled that trigger, or gave that order, or simply watched without intervening, would you call it justice or something else? If you found this exploration worth your time, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Where, for you, is the absolute line that even righteous anger must never cross?